On the first day of May, 1945, soldiers of the 36th Infantry Division walked into a house in the Bavarian town of Bad Tölz. Inside, they found a 69-year-old man in a field marshal's uniform. His name was Gerd von Rundstedt, and for most of the last 3 years, he had been the senior German commander in the West. He was the man Hitler turned to whenever the Western Front needed a steady hand and a famous name. This was the man who commanded the defense of France during the Normandy landings. He led Germany through the autumn battles on the border, the desperate Ardennes offensive, and the ultimate loss of everything west of the Rhine. Now, he was left with a failing heart, a defeated nation, and endless time to contemplate how it had all fallen apart. His American captors began interrogating him, but after he suffered a heart attack, they handed him over to British custody. Yet both before and after, through a series of interrogations stretching over 2 years, Rundstedt gave the Allies his own account of the collapse in the West, pointing to several key factors. He pointed to the sky and to the lack of fuel, but he kept returning with bitter professional focus to one specific detail most outsiders would never expect a field marshal to emphasize. He flatly stated that, by the end, the German military simply could not move trains. This was not some minor administrative grievance. To him, it was the absolute core of their defeat. An American intelligence report from March of 1946 captured his reasoning, and the words his interrogators remembered best were blunt and despairing. The root of all our trouble, he told them, was air power. Air power. And the specific way Allied aviation broke his army was by shattering the railroads. He declared that in the final months it was impossible to get even one train across the Rhine. Let's consider what that statement really means. An army does not run on courage alone. It runs on coal, food, ammunition, and spare parts. And in 1944, almost none of those supplies moved by truck. It all went by rail. Every German division on the Western Front was tethered by a steel lifeline to the factories of the Ruhr and the yards of the Rhineland. That lifeline was the railway. Sever that connection, and even the toughest combat units are reduced to what they can carry on their backs. Rundstedt was admitting to his captors that the Allies had figured out how to sever that vital link, not just in a single spot that could be quickly patched, but everywhere, all at once, faster than any repair crews could ever fix the brakes. This is the side of the war Hollywood usually ignores, because there is nothing cinematic about a freight schedule. There are no dramatic last stands in this story, no ridges held to the final man. Instead, it was a slow, deliberate, year-long strangulation of an entire continent, executed by pilots in the sky and planners with slide rules. And when it was over, the most formidable army in Europe could not even transport its tanks to the front lines. How do you strip an army of its rail network? That is the real mystery. And it starts, like so many Allied triumphs, with a fierce debate between men fighting on the exact same side. If you are enjoying this deep dive, please take a moment to hit the like button. It truly helps this history reach others who care. The conflict was over targeting. By early 1944, the Allied nations had amassed an aerial armada unlike anything the world had ever witnessed. Thousands of heavy bombers and escort fighters filled the airfields of England, with the invasion of France looming large. Before any of those bombs could target the rail lines, however, one critical obstacle had to be cleared. It was settled in late February 1944 during a massive aerial campaign known as Big Week. For 6 days, American heavy bombers systematically targeted German aircraft factories, deliberately acting as bait to lure the Luftwaffe fighters up into a meat grinder with long-range Allied escorts. It was a brutal, exhausting week, and by the end, air supremacy over Germany had shifted forever. The Luftwaffe's fighter force would never fully recover. Historian Williamson Murray observed that everything else the Allied air forces accomplished in 1944, including the rail campaign, relied on this foundation. Dominating the daylight skies was the ultimate prerequisite. Without it, any fighter bomber hunting a steam engine over Europe would have quickly become the prey. With the skies secured, the crucial debate finally landed on the table at Eisenhower's headquarters. With D-Day looming, where should this massive destructive power be directed to inflict the maximum damage on Germany? Two opposing strategies emerged, championed by commanders who thoroughly disliked one another. The first proposal targeted oil production. American commanders, led by Lieutenant General Carl Spaatz of the Strategic Air Forces, believed they could end the war early by destroying Germany's synthetic oil plants. Spaatz was a tough, quiet Pennsylvanian born in 1891, and he carried a cold, unyielding logic. Strangle their fuel, Spaatz argued, and you do not simply slow the German army down. You ground the Luftwaffe, freeze the panzers, and force enemy fighters into the sky to protect refineries, where Allied escorts can easily destroy them. Spaatz submitted his formal case in early March 1944. His operations deputy, Major General Frederick Anderson, backed him. But another option emerged: the railways. Its champion was Air Marshal Arthur Tedder, Eisenhower's deputy at Supreme Headquarters. Behind Tedder stood an unlikely ally, a South African-born zoologist named Solly Zuckerman. Zuckerman had spent the prior year studying how bombs actually impacted Mediterranean rail networks. He had watched the intense air campaigns against Pantelleria, Sicily, and the Italian mainland, and carefully analyzed the wreckage afterward with scientific patience. He reached a highly counterintuitive conclusion. The best way to wreck a railway was not chasing individual trains, nor even dropping bridges. It was to smash marshalling yards and locomotive repair shops, the great mechanical hearts where trains were assembled, sorted, and sent out again. Destroy those, Zuckerman argued, and the system would seize from within, slowly at first, then all at once. What sat on Eisenhower's desk in March of 1944 was no simple choice between two good options. It was a clash of theories on how a modern industrial power could be brought down, and the cost of getting it wrong would be measured in the lives of the men waiting ashore in Normandy. Both sides sharply exposed real weaknesses in the opposing plans. The oil advocates warned that rail damage could be repaired very quickly, that the Germans were masterfully quick at patching tracks and bridging gaps, and that bombing French rail yards would do nothing to help on D-Day itself. The transportation advocates fired back, pointing out oil plants sat deep inside Germany, that they were few and savagely defended, and that hitting them wouldn't yield results fast enough to protect the landings. Both arguments were partly right. That made the choice incredibly difficult. Leave a like if you agree, as a darker objection emerged, separate from military efficiency. The marshalling yards Zuckerman wanted to bomb were not out in empty countryside. They sat inside French and Belgian towns, ringed by the homes of the railway workers and their families. To bomb those yards meant killing civilians. The British government understood this dilemma with painful clarity. Bomber Command warned that the campaign could cause 80,000 to 160,000 French casualties, with a quarter dying. Winston Churchill recoiled. In early April, he declared he would not be party to the slaughter of helpless French civilians, writing a personal appeal to President Roosevelt to plead his case. Roosevelt's reply, delivered on May 11th, 1944, was uncompromising. However regrettable the loss of civilian life, he would impose no military restrictions on the operations. The plan had to go forward. The ultimate decision came during a meeting on March 25th, 1944, at Eisenhower's headquarters, where Tedder's transportation plan carried the day. The decisive argument was not about which target mattered more in theory. It was about air control and what the bombers could actually achieve before June. Eisenhower had already made it clear how much this mattered. 3 days earlier, he warned his staff that if command of the air was not granted to him, he would ask to be relieved. A supreme commander does not threaten to resign over a minor issue. He threatened it over this because he understood that France's railways were the very roads German reinforcements would use to reach the beaches, and he wanted them destroyed before his men ever set foot on the sand. Let's look at a number. That puts this massive decision in perspective, and it comes from the final accounting the Americans did after the war. Across the entire Allied bombing campaign, transportation targets received roughly 32% of all dropped tonnage. Oil received just 9%. When we compare these figures, we see the March decision written in pure tonnage. The railways took the lion's share of the weight, and bomber crews spent the next year delivering it. If you love history, subscribe as our story leaves the dry conference rooms and climbs into the contested skies, where young airmen who had never even heard of Solly Zuckerman began executing a decision made far above their heads. The bombing campaign began in earnest that spring. Heavy bombers targeted the massive rail yards, the British by night and the Americans by day, unleashing staggering tonnage. By D-Day, The Allies had dropped roughly 76,000 tons of bombs on French railways. In the Seine Valley alone, as we look at the weeks surrounding those crucial landings, roughly 22,000 aircraft sorties dropped over 42,000 tons of bombs onto about 100 separate railway targets between Le Havre and Paris. The goal was to completely seal off the battlefield, making it impossible for German forces to reinforce Normandy by rail, and it worked. Its impact on the ground was felt in the most direct way imaginable. In early March of 1944, the German military rail network in northern France could move 58,000 tons of supplies a day. By early May, after 2 months of relentless bombing, that capacity was slashed to 25,000 tons daily, less than half, before the invasion even started. The terrible cost Churchill feared was paid, and history must not ignore it. Allied bombs rained down on French towns, whose only crime was having a rail yard at their center. Places like Caen, Saint-Lô, and Vire were completely devastated, while French civilian casualties climbed into the tens of thousands during the campaign. This grim reality remains on the record, and the pilots flying these missions were fully aware of it. Yet they flew anyway, knowing the alternative was a German army moving completely unchecked toward the vulnerable beachheads. The painful calculation at Eisenhower's headquarters was that losing French lives now was the tragic price for saving far more Allied lives later. It is a brutal calculation to put into words, and it was even harder to execute, but it was made deliberately by commanders who understood the stakes. An honest historical account cannot hide this harsh truth behind modern terms like surgical strikes. In the end, those heavy bombers were a blunt instrument, and the most precise work fell to smaller aircraft using a simpler concept. The river bridges were the ultimate choke points. A railway yard could be repaired in days, but destroying a massive river bridge was another matter. The Seine bridges, specifically, served as the primary gateways for all German supplies. At first, military planners believed that destroying a major rail bridge required massive raids by heavy bombers, involving hundreds of planes and thousands of tons of explosives. Then on May 7th, 1944, 8 American P-47 Thunderbolts roared in low against the 650-foot railway bridge over the Seine at Vernon. Each fighter carried 2 1,000-pound bombs. They dropped the entire bridge into the river. 8 planes, 16 bombs, 1 bridge. Where military doctrine called for an armada, they found a revelation. A single fighter bomber, diving steeply and releasing its payload late, could destroy a bridge at a fraction of the cost. The Allies quickly applied this tactic to every vital crossing. By late May, Air Marshal Tedder noted, as historian Rebecca Grant documented, that along the Seine routes, not a single train was running. The natural river barrier that the Germans relied on for supply had instead become a trap at their backs. This was the first method of dismantling the rails, the systematic planned destruction of permanent targets. But there was a second, much wilder, and far more personal method, one that proved terrifying to the German soldiers on the ground. Officially called armed reconnaissance, the pilots who flew these missions simply called it train busting. Squadrons of fighters would sweep across occupied France and Western Germany with no set targets, searching solely for anything moving along the tracks. A steam locomotive is a massive, highly vulnerable target. A single burst of 50 caliber machine gun fire into the boiler unleashed a massive cloud of steam visible for miles, instantly disabling the engine and trapping dozens of other trains stranded right behind it. This shift in tactics came directly from the 8th Air Force commander, Lieutenant General James Doolittle, the same legendary leader who commanded the Tokyo raid back in 1942. In early 1944, Doolittle rewrote the rules for his escort pilots. For months, Allied Mustangs and Thunderbolts had been strictly chained to the main bomber formations, forbidden from leaving the formations they guarded, even when tempting targets practically begged to be struck. Doolittle changed that. Once the bombers headed home, the escort pilots were ordered to dive low and destroy anything of military value, which almost always meant targets on the tracks. It was a highly controversial decision because low-altitude strafing runs made fighter pilots far more vulnerable to ground fire, spiking casualty rates. But it forged the American fighter units from a defensive shield into an offensive sword, and German rail networks felt the devastation instantly. The American tactical forces, particularly the 9th Air Force, turned this into a science. Subscribe to see how. Their fighter bombers severed German railway lines at more than 1,000 points in the autumn of 1944, wrecking nearly 1,000 locomotives during that same period. In daylight, any German engineer who stoked his engine was practically inviting a thunderbolt down on his head. Let's look at the tactical air commanders who systematized this warfare, because their names deserve to be remembered. The 9th Air Force, the primary tactical unit responsible for most train busting across the front lines, was commanded through that spring by Lieutenant General Louis Brereton, a Pittsburgh native and a legendary veteran of American military aviation. In August of 1944, Brighton took over the Allied Airborne Army, handing command of the 9th to Major General Hugh Vandenberg, a Milwaukee officer in his mid-40s, who would direct the tactical rail campaign across France and into Germany for the rest of the war. Beneath them stood the officers directing those fighter bombers, and today we are going to look closely at two of them. Major General Elwood Quesada, a Washington native whom everyone called Pete, led the 9th Tactical Air Command supporting the First Army. He was easily the most innovative air officer the Americans had on the Western Front. He took radar systems meant to warn of incoming enemy aircraft and completely flipped their purpose, using them to guide his own fighter bombers onto German trains and military columns in near real time. He even placed Air Force pilots inside the lead Sherman tanks of armored columns, equipped with radios so pilots and ground troops could talk directly to one another. This was a quiet revolution in air-to-ground cooperation, and the German railway was always at the very top of their target list. Alongside him, supporting Patton's Third Army, was Major General Otto Wayland, a Texan nicknamed Opie, whom Patton flatly called the best damn general in the air. These were not desk generals. They built the machine that found German movement and systematically destroyed it. In the late summer of 1944, there was a brief period when the rail campaign practically vanished from the history books. Understanding why is crucial, and if you enjoy these deep historical dives, please hit subscribe as it reveals how this war actually operated. Following the American breakout from Normandy in late July, the front advanced so rapidly that ruined French railways simply ceased to matter. The German army in the west was routed, with Allied forces chasing them across France. For several tense weeks, the crisis was not German logistics but Allied logistics, the grueling race to get fuel and ammunition to fast-moving American columns. For a brief moment, railway interdictions seemed like yesterday's war. Then, that autumn, the front stalled at the German border. The easy victories ended, pushing the rail campaign inside Germany back to the absolute center of strategy. Now, the targets were German marshalling yards in Hamm, Cologne, Mainz, Saarbrücken, Kassel, and a dozen other places where Allied bombers returned repeatedly throughout the autumn and winter. It was not just railways. Germany had another way to transport heavy freight: the massive inland canals carrying coal and ore on barges through their industrial heartland, and the Allies targeted those as well. In the autumn of 1944, the Dortmund-Ems and Mittelland canals, Germany's critical water highways, were bombed, breached, and entirely drained, leaving cargo barges stranded in the mud. A waterway, much like a railroad, only works when it is whole. One precise hit can drain miles of it. By striking both rails and canals, the Allies choked off every cheap route the Ruhr Valley had to supply coal and steel to the front. That left only the roads, and by day, those roads belonged entirely to Allied fighter bombers. By the winter of 1944, there was virtually no safe way to move heavy German freight. The pilots doing this work were ordinary on the ground, but lethal in the air. Consider one example. On May 28th, 1944, near Hasselt, Belgium, fighters of the 365th Fighter Group, a 9th Air Force outfit known as the Hellhawks, swept down on a railway bridge and discovered a German troop train packed with artillery. First Lieutenant Neil Worley dived straight for the locomotive. During his second run, low and fast, he flew right through the support cable of a railway water tower. 40 feet of half-inch steel cable wrapped around his propeller, yet he somehow flew his heavily damaged P-47 back to base. This was the brutal reality of train busting. It was never glamorous, it claimed countless young lives on both sides, and it never stopped. If you are finding this story fascinating, drop a like, because there is one pilot whose life ties this entire campaign together in an unexpected way. His name was George Preddy. Born in Greensboro, North Carolina on February 5, 1919, he was the son of a local railroad worker. That connection holds a quiet symmetry that the war made cruel. The father spent his life keeping railroads running on the ground, while the son spent his war tearing them apart from the sky. Prey was a small, intense, and absolutely magnificent pilot. He flew with the 352nd Fighter Group out of Bodney in Norfolk, England, a legendary unit whose blue-nosed Mustangs earned a famous nickname. He started out flying the P-47 Thunderbolt before converting to the P-51 Mustang alongside his group, and he began the war as an ordinary fighter pilot, escorting heavy bombers deep into Germany and strafing any target of opportunity on the return flight. His combat reports from the spring of 1944 cover both ground and air actions. On April 28, 1944, near Bourges in France, his flight swooped down on a locomotive, destroying it to share the kill among the four of them. Around the days of the invasion, his squadron's archives recorded constant strikes on locomotives, trains, trucks, and buses, the grinding daily task of choking off German logistics. He was a pilot killing trains from above, the son of a man who ran them on the ground. Surely that irony was not lost on him. But Prey's true genius lay in the air-to-air duel. And on one August morning he demonstrated this skill in a way that etched his name into the history books. On August 6, 1944, during a single sortie near Hamburg, Prey shot down 6 German Messerschmitt 109 fighters. 6 in one flight. He became one of only a tiny handful of American pilots in the whole war to destroy that many enemy aircraft in a single day. He was decorated with the Distinguished Service Cross for this action on August 12, 1944. By that autumn, he was given command of his own squadron, the 328th, and was on track to become the highest-scoring American Mustang ace in Europe. Keep his name in mind. We will return to him, and if you want to follow his journey to the end, make sure to subscribe. While Prey, Worley, and thousands like them fought in the skies, the deeper campaign against the German rail network ground on through the winter of 1944, it began to produce a sweeping result that no single raid could capture, but that the data makes undeniable. To understand what was happening, you must understand what the German railway represented. The Reichsbahn was no mere convenience. It served as the essential circulatory system of the entire German war machine, spanning roughly 68 to 70,000 kilometers of route, operated by over 1.4 million people, hauling one primary cargo coal. Roughly 40% of all freight moving on German rails was coal, and coal was life. It forged the steel. It fueled the power plants, heated the massive factories, and even drove the very locomotives hauling that coal. That final point was the trap. A coal-burning railway deprived of its fuel cannot transport the very coal it needs to stay running. Damage that network severely enough, and it does not merely slow down, it begins to devour itself. And the Western Front sat at the absolute end of that braking system, the final stop on the line, the spot that received whatever scraps remained after the factories, cities, and power plants took their massive share. When the railway system began to collapse, the front lines felt it first and hardest. A combat division in the Rhineland in the winter of 1944 needed no imagination to see the crisis. It needed artillery shells that simply never arrived, fuel that was missing, and replacement vehicles stranded in yards 200 miles to the east with no way to move forward. Rundstedt was the commander responsible for that front, and this railway collapse was no mere abstraction to him. It meant a daily, grinding shortage of every single resource his soldiers needed to fight. The researcher who proved this, using the railway's own archives, was American historian Alfred Miasvsky, who dug through surviving files of the German Reich, Transport Ministry after the war, reconstructing week by week exactly how many freight cars the network put onto the rails. This metric, known as car placement, is the ultimate measure of whether a transport system is alive or dying. Here is what his findings show, relying on the same raw data gathered by wartime bombing investigators. In the week ending August 19th, 1944, the German railway placed 900,000 freight cars. That was their peak. By late October, that dropped to 700,000. By December 23rd, during the Ardennes offensive, it fell to 550,000. By the week of March 3rd, 1945, it collapsed to 214,000. After that point, German records became useless because the infrastructure had broken down beyond anyone's ability to keep count. Let those figures sink in. From 900,000 to 214,000 in 7 months, a drop of over 3/4. This is not a railway under strain. This is a system in its final death throes. The crisis was worst exactly where it mattered most. In the Ruhr, the industrial heart feeding the Western Front. In the Essen division, where Ruhr coal began its journey, daily placements averaged 21,400 at the start of 1944. Following intense autumn raids, they fell to 12,000. By January 1945, they hit 9,000. By February, those numbers were, for all practical purposes, zero. The railway's own coal reserves tell a matching story. 18 days of supply in October 1944, down to 4.5 by February. Some southern regions held less than a single day's supply, and when the coal stops, the steel stops. Ruhr steel production plummeted 80% between June and December of 1944. This detail captures the tragedy of the German position better than any other. German tank manufacturing actually reached its absolute wartime peak in December of 1944. That is, nearly 1,900 vehicles in a single month. A stunning achievement under such heavy bombing. But it did not matter. Less than half of those tanks ever reached the front lines because the shattered railways simply could not carry them there. They were built, they just could not be delivered. Picture a finished tank sitting in a factory yard on one end, a battlefield on the other, and nothing between them but broken tracks and burned-out locomotives. That was the core of Rundstedt's complaint. He was not imagining things. The vital lifeline had been severed. Let's look for a moment at how the Germans responded, because it shows just how thoroughly they were beaten here. They were not passive. The Reichsbahn fought back with incredible energy, throwing desperate repair crews at every single break, rebuilding bridges, laying bypass tracks around ruined junctions, doing the patient, exhausting work of keeping a crippled railway limping forward. For most of the war, the Germans had been incredibly good at this, which was a major argument against the entire plan. But by the autumn of 1944, the breaks were coming much faster than the crews could fix them. A rail yard repaired one week was bombed again the next. And that effort itself was a massive victory for the Allies. The bombing forced Germany to divert a huge share of its war economy, easily 1/3 by some estimates, along with nearly 2 million workers, all poured into air defense and repairing what the bombs had shattered. Every laborer filling a crater near Cologne was a man not building a tank or loading a shell. The bombing campaign crippled Germany, even in the places where it seemed to fail. The American economists and officers of the United States Strategic Bombing Survey, who walked into the ruins in the summer of 1945 to measure the actual destruction, reached an unmistakable conclusion. The targeted attack on transportation, they wrote, was the decisive blow that completely shattered the German economy. That is a cautious institution choosing a very heavy word, and they did not arrive at it easily because the authors of the report did not all agree. A fascinating point we will return to, because that disagreement is part of the honest history. Many of you watching have a personal connection to this war, and the railway campaign swept in more men than the famous battles ever did. From the pilots and bomber crews to the tireless ground crews who kept them flying. If your father, grandfather, or uncle served in this conflict, please share their name, unit, and theater in the comments below to honor their memory. These brave men are slipping out of living memory much faster than we realize. And a name written down is a name remembered. The final act played out along the Rhine in early 1945, unfolding in 2 parts, one Allied and one strangely German. The Allied strategy focused on systematically severing the last river crossings, building on a full year of destruction against the wider system. By now, the fuel and railway campaigns were strangling Germany together, each making the other far worse. German aviation fuel output from the synthetic plants, which stood at 175,000 tons in April of 1944, plunged to 30,000 by July, and just 5,000 by September. A drop of more than 90% in 5 months. A Luftwaffe that cannot fuel its fighters, cannot defend the skies, and a railway system that cannot operate, cannot transport what little fuel remains to the frontline troops who need it. These 2 catastrophic collapses fed on each other. In late February, The rail campaign reached a peak with a massive operation committing nearly 9,000 Allied aircraft on February 22nd and 23rd, 1945, striking more than 200 transport targets across western Germany. They targeted not just major cities, but the tiny junctions and rural stations previously left untouched, the vital little hubs the Germans relied on to bypass their shattered main lines. Allied fighters alone claimed nearly 600 locomotives and over 3,800 rail cars in just 2 days. The cost was heavy. 90 Allied aircraft failed to return. And then there were the bridges that simply refused to fall. The massive viaduct at Bierfeld carried the vital Eastern Line. It survived over 50 raids and 3,000 tons of explosives without collapsing. On March 14th, 1945, the British deployed a devastating new weapon, a 22,000-pound bomb called the Grand Slam, designed not to hit the span directly, but to bury itself deep in the soil nearby, collapsing the very earth beneath the stone piers. A single Grand Slam and several smaller bombs instantly dropped 100 yards of the viaduct into the valley. The Allies dropped over 40 of those colossal bombs in the coming weeks, methodically collapsing one stubborn bridge after another across western Germany. Even the minor river crossings were not spared. The legendary railway bridge at Well near the mouth of the Ruhr collapsed during this offensive, leaving the surrounding town over 90% destroyed by the air raids preceding the Rhine crossing. By the 1st of March, 1945, of the 25 railway bridges crossing the Rhine, only 4 remained standing. And this is where the German side of the story takes a bizarre turn. Those final 4 did not all fall to Allied bombs. German engineers actually blew up most of these final Rhine crossings themselves. They had orders to deny the Americans entry, as they could no longer defend the West Bank and wanted to wall themselves off behind the river. The most famous of these was the Ludendorff Railway Bridge at Remagen. American forces captured it intact on March 7, 1945, in a legendary stroke of luck after a German demolition charge failed to explode. It stood just long enough to funnel 6 divisions across, before collapsing on March 17th under severe strain and constant battering, killing 28 American Army engineers trying to save it and injuring 93 others. By mid-March, not a single railway bridge remained standing over the Rhine. Rundstedt's grim prediction had finally become a literal reality. Now, let us be honest about that statement, because history does not exist to flatter anyone, not even the brave crews who flew for the Allies. When Rundstedt claimed it was impossible to run even one train across the Rhine, he was exaggerating, as any careful historian should recognize. Trains did manage to cross in shrinking numbers well into early March. The final 4 standing bridges carried what little supply traffic the German military could still muster. Strictly speaking, his dramatic claim went too far, but as a description of the actual operational reality, it was basically correct. By February of 1945, reliable railway transport across the Rhine had practically ceased. Crucial Ruhr coal was no longer reaching the front lines in any meaningful amount. Marshalling yards on the East Bank were shattered faster than crews could patch them, and any train moving in daylight was ruthlessly hunted down. Rundstedt was a commander, giving a broad military summary, not an analyst filing a report. His conclusion was right, even if the math was loose. We must also face a second truth, one that complicates the simple narrative of this campaign. This was not a solely American victory, nor was it bloodless. The heaviest bombs that ultimately shattered the Rhine bridges were actually British. British crews flew relentless night missions against German yards alongside American daytime raids, executing a concept conceived by a British scientist for a British air marshal. It was a true coalition that broke the German rail network, and any narrative that credits a single nation is selling patriotic myths rather than the complicated historical truth. And the terrible price was paid largely by people who never wore a military uniform. The massive transportation plan designed to isolate Normandy claimed thousands of French and Belgian civilian lives. These were families living right next to the targeted rail yards. In total, Allied bombing killed over 68,000 French civilians during the war. Within Germany itself, the casualties were far higher. Hundreds of thousands of civilians perished in the broader bombing campaign, and Allied commanders knew exactly what their orders meant. Before launching the massive February raids against German junctions, American General Ira Eaker warned General Karl Spaatz in writing that such devastating raids would convince the Germans they were fighting barbarians, noting that over 95% of those killed would likely be innocent civilians. He was not disobeying the command, but rather ensuring history recorded that he fully understood the consequences. That warning, preserved in official archives, stands as a rare moment of honesty in the campaign because it refused to sugarcoat the grim reality. How did Rundstedt himself eventually come to view the disaster unfolding around him? In truth, he understood it completely and far earlier than most, having felt the pressure from the very start. Historians analyzing the German archives find Rundstedt and his staff constantly protesting against Allied dominance over the rails, starting in early 1944, which forced him to divert tens of thousands of defensive workers from the Atlantic Wall, 18,000 in April alone, and 10,000 more in May, simply to keep French railways operational. Let us consider what that meant. The very enemy preparing to invade his beaches was already striking deep into his rear, forcing him to dismantle his own coastal defenses just to keep supply trains running. The Field Marshal was fighting a war in which his vital supply lines were dismantled behind him by an enemy he could neither see nor reach. By the spring of 1945, German Armaments Minister Albert Speer was delivering the same warning to Hitler in writing. In a mid-March memorandum, Speer declared that the entire German economy faced total collapse within weeks. The core of his warning matched Rundstedt's primary crisis: the total paralysis of the railways and the loss of coal transport. They could no longer move. Speer had obvious motives to blame Allied air raids instead of his own ministry, a detail historians must carefully keep in mind. After the war, Speer spent days with his American interrogators, analyzing the bombing campaign in exhaustive detail. He actually described these sessions as a sort of school, gladly blaming the Allied air campaign for Germany's collapse rather than pointing to his own failures. Yet, the railway data did not just rely on Speer's word. It came directly from German rail records, confirming exactly what he claimed. The most self-interested witness and the coldest hard numbers completely agreed. Historians have debated ever since how to rank these causes, a dispute that began within the American bombing survey itself. The oil division concluded oil was decisive, while transport experts and the economists analyzing the wider economy insisted that transportation took down the system. One of those brilliant economists was John Kenneth Galbraith, who later wrote about defending the survey's transport findings against intense Air Force pressure. He did so, in his own words, with maximum arrogance and minimum tact. The disagreement was never fully resolved. Some later historians, like Alfred Mierzejewski, put the destruction of the railways first, calling it the single decisive factor. Others, like Richard Overy and Tommy Davis Biddle, argue that the rail and oil campaigns cannot be separated, that they worked together with the broader weight of the bombing to grind Germany down. Most historians lean toward this second view. The force that broke Germany was not a single-target system, but the total crushing weight of the Allied air campaign, and the railway was where that weight finally came to rest. And nearly all analyses arrive at the same point, which Rundstedt himself seemed to grasp in captivity. The three pillars he named the air, the fuel, and the rails were never separate causes. They were parts of one single machine. Allied command of the air, won in that bloody week in February 1944, made the rail and oil campaigns possible at all. The loss of fuel meant Germans could not truck their way around broken rail lines. And those broken rail lines meant that what little fuel and what few tanks Germany still produced could never reach the frontline troops who needed them. Sever any single strand, and the others pulled tighter. The Americans and the British cut all three. If this historical account has kept you hooked, a quick like and subscribe helps the channel immensely, costing you absolutely nothing. Let us return to where this story began, with the old field marshal in the captured house at Bad Tolls, because there is one more detail in his testimony worth holding on to. When a commander like Rundstedt, a Prussian of the old school who spent his entire life around armies, sat down to explain his defeat, he did not focus first on the courage of Allied troops or the genius of any one general. Instead, he spoke of logistics, the dull, unglamorous, decisive reality that an army that cannot be supplied simply cannot fight, and that the Allies had stripped his supplies away, one bridge, one marshalling yard, and one locomotive at a time. And the men who accomplished this were, for the most part, completely unsung. They were pilots like Neil Worley, who flew a mangled Thunderbolt home with a steel cable wrapped around his propeller. And they were men like Major George Preddy of Greensboro, North Carolina, the railroad man's son who flew the rail war and the air war both. Preddy did not survive to see the railways finally collapse. On Christmas Day, December 25th, 1944, in the middle of the Ardennes battle, he chased a German fighter low over the front lines near Langerway, only to be killed not by the enemy, but by American anti-aircraft gunners on the ground, who failed to recognize his Mustang in the chaos of that desperate week. He was 25 years old. He had destroyed nearly 27 enemy planes in the air, more than any other American Mustang pilot in Europe, along with a long string of trains and enemy trucks on the ground, yet he was brought down by friendly fire on a clear winter morning. His younger brother William, also a Mustang pilot, died over Czechoslovakia the following April. Today, the two brothers lie side by side in the Lorraine American Cemetery at Sonnevald in France. That is the grim reality of war, not the polished version shown in movies. It does not always allow the finest men to finish their work, nor does it spare families who gave more than one son to the cause. But the job was finished by those who followed, and the ultimate proof lies in the admissions of the enemy themselves. Rundstedt confessed as much in captivity, with nothing left to gain. The root of his entire defeat was air power, and what air power ultimately did was take his trains away. By the end, he could not move a single train across the Rhine. Their names deserve to be remembered.